Hello and welcome to Deep in Pact, a proud member of the Duff Network, where we dive deep into Wildbow's most tattooed work 5 years on. Coming up next is Elliot Diebold.
And that was Ruben Morehouse.
And we are back to talk about Subordination 6.2, which begins with Blake not quite taking a shower, just making himself presentable while Alexis and Joel wait for the others to arrive.
Yeah, and so, this sort of starts off by Blake saying, I don't have time for, a whole shower, so I'm just going to wipe myself down with a cloth a bit. And, you really got to wonder how effective that was, because he's, assuming the glamour's coming off, he's still meant to be covered in, hundreds of, rat bites and stuff from the Pauz incident, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a bit later where Tiffany comes in and she's like, what the hell happened to you? And Blake is sort of like, oh, is it that obvious? And it's like, I don't know what you thought wiping yourself down with a cloth was going to do, considering all the shit you've been through.
Yeah. He's an optimist, this Blake is.
But I mean, I guess the main point of it really isn't even actually to make himself feel presentable, but to make himself feel like he's as presentable as possible. I think he's talked a lot about how, if he feels good about his appearance, then that's good for his just general mental state. So as long as he feels kind of good about it, that's all that really matters.
It also kind of gives me the vibe of him just kind of trying to distract himself a bit and not have to talk to Alexis and Joel until everyone else is there.
Yeah, well, because we see he comes out in a minute and they're both pinging him with questions. So it's an awkward, it's like an awkward waiting game that they're playing while everyone else isn't showing up.
Actually, there's a specific point that I quite like, a quote I'm going to pull out here where Tiffany is asking what happened to him, and Blake says, I'll explain when everyone's here.
So you mean Alexis?
The next line is... no, is it Tiffany? No, yeah, Tiffany asks, what happened to you? And Blake says, I'll explain when everyone's here. And then after that, the next line is, the others arrived. And reading this for the second time made me realize, are we just to take it that they're all kind of sitting in silence for, 20 minutes while they wait for everyone else?
I mean, in Blake's current state, he could easily do that. So, yeah, probably.
It's true. I wonder what's going through their head. We get a number of beats at the start of this chapter of Alexis being really worried about Blake, which is interesting. They're basically trying to figure out if Blake has completely lost it or not. It's a fun, weird dynamic to set up the start of the chapter.
Yeah, well, because there's another bit later where Blake mentions that he's so weak right now because he expended too much personal power. And Joel sort of is like, oh, you mean self-harm? And it's this real moment of, Blake is essentially trying to tell them, I got these big cuts on my arm because I had to cut myself to use magic powers. And I think if you're hearing that, it's pretty reasonable to assume that there's some mental illness type stuff going on.
No, it sounds normal to me.
Yeah. And yeah, there is this sort of sense of, for some of them, the more genuine proof they're seeing, it's almost the more ridiculous this whole thing is, which kind of makes sense to me. As Blake's sort of proving magic's real, it goes from this kind of concerning / interesting tale that he's telling to you actually have to come to terms with this being real, and it's almost that's when the backfire effect starts going off, and you start being no, this couldn't be real.
Yeah. It's fun. Of course, we know Blake's telling the truth, so we're never quite in their shoes, but you can imagine it would be pretty wild from their perspective.
Yeah, and we see all those rationalizations that they make as stuff's going on.
I want to pull out one other quote, which I really like, where Evan and Blake are talking, and obviously Alexis and Joel can't hear that side of the conversation. Can't hear Evan's side of the conversation.
Yeah.
And Evan says, she's the person you were talking about when you talked about your tattoos. Yeah, I said, but let's maybe not get into something that intimate. And Alexis says, non sequitur much, which is a great, funny beat. And this whole chapter is stacked full of funny moments. It's a good, this whole chapter is kind of this good, humorous break in between kind of depressing nightmares.
Yeah,
which is nice.
Well, I mean, Blake smiles after Alexis calls him out on it. I think he knew what he was doing, and I think he knew how she'd react. Because it's just, it's such awkward and shit-stirring phrasing that I can't believe that it's possibly an accident on his part. It's just too good.
Yeah,
and yeah, I agree. I like it. There's some tense stuff going on in this chapter, but it's all undercut by little bits of banter every now and then between friends, which works quite well.
Now, I wrote down this next note at midnight just because I had this realization where this chapter is kind of a break in the pacing that gives us some humor to kind of, for us, the readers, give us a break before we dive more into the pressing stuff again. And obviously it serves the same purpose for Blake. And I kind of only just connected this thought that Blake's personal power could just be a metaphor for pacing, for us as the audience being drained, right? Like, you know, we get the intense arcs and then we get the downtime of Blake being at home, like at the start of arc 4 or this chapter here.
Yeah.
It's really this whole like in-universe metaphors for the way literary things work really just can go to a very fun extreme.
No, I see what you mean, because definitely there's something nice and rejuvenating for us as readers when Blake just gets a moment to like do some stuff with his friends after all the shit he's been through.
Not just that, you know, the other ways to get power, like Blake getting a familiar, also we can interpret that as being, okay, now there's Evan, this other character who kind of mixes up the story and kind of mixes up the pacing a fair amount. It's like, it interprets so well.
Yeah, you're right. It does work quite well, and you know, Pact has made a point of bringing out meta stuff into the story. So you know, I'd be willing to buy that's somewhat intentional. Yeah.
So eventually, Tiffany, Goosh, Tyler, and Joseph all arrive, and Blake tries to explain to them that magic is real. But before he starts explaining it to them, and he obviously has a plan for how to prove it. But before he does that, he asks them all one at a time, are they interested in hearing them out? Are they interested in hearing him out, knowing that it might make some terrifying things real for them?
Yeah, and there's a couple of bits here where Blake is confused as to what Tiffany's doing here,
Yeah.
which is it feels like it's going to lead up to some sort of payoff. Hopefully, not a terrible one, but you know, she keeps showing up in his life, like, you know, ever since he's awakened, and I don't know. I mean, I guess he would have probably spotted if she was up to something by now, but I don't know. It does seem curious that she keeps showing up in all these situations where you wouldn't really expect her to. So I hope nothing bad is associated with that, because I like Tiffany and I don't want anything bad to happen to her. But this is Pact, so I'm trying to keep my expectations in check there.
Yeah. So in universe, the reasoning that's given is Alexis calls her because, you know, Alexis thinks that she should kind of be here. Alexis is still trying to play, maybe not matchmaker, but like friend matchmaker, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the excuse that is given, but I don't know if that feels like enough to me, given the seriousness of the situation and the intimacy of sort of the rest of it. Like, I don't know. I feel like that'd be Alexis, maybe not reading the room quite right, or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, fair. So Blake doesn't try and convince them yet. He kind of gives them a chance to opt in, which I think we remembered. I remembered when we were talking about, hey, what would you tell your non-practitioner friends if you were a practitioner? Our discussion question, something like 2 arcs ago, I think it was.
Yeah.
A long time ago. We kind of landed on, this is the most ethical way to do it. So it's nice to see that Blake is taking that approach too.
Yeah, and I mean, in my book, it should mitigate the karmic responsibility that is associated with you bringing them into the world if you give them... Like, basically, all he said at this point before giving them a chance to get out is, hey, I'm saying magic is real. Like, believe it or not, and maybe stick around and I can prove it to you. And to me, that's, like, as you said, that seems like the most ethical way to do it. And I'd like to think that the spirits would take that into account as well. Him giving them an out opportunity is an important factor, but you never know.
I definitely don't get the vibe that Blake thinks it will have done anything.
No, definitely not. Wait, that's not something he considers. It's just something he thinks is his responsibility anyway. Which again is because he's a pretty good dude. And so we meet 2 new people here. I think maybe they were at the party. I honestly don't remember, but they weren't really introduced in the same way they are here. And so we get Tyler, who's one of those annoyingly talented people, but he bounces around from thing to thing, a bit of a jack of all trades type person. and then there's Joseph, who Blake basically says isn't like the most naturally talented, but he's really good at sort of keeping his pulse on what the community's into, and he basically just sounds like a really good potential practitioner. So of course, he's the only one who is smart enough to get the fuck out. But we'll get there, I guess.
Yeah. I like these characters. We're kind of building up Blake's friend army here. It's nice. We'll see what the story has in store for them, I suppose. So Blake, as his confirmation to convince people, Blake has Evan write out some words. He has him write out, "It's all true," which is a very neat trick, but for some reason doesn't fully convince everybody.
Yeah, and I actually have a friend who works for some of the Australian zoos training birds, and so I double checked with him, and you cannot get birds to do this. Like, this is not something you can train birds to do. So yeah, it's definitely that sense of like the kickback to trying to have your complete understanding of the universe pulled out from under you, I guess, is they just all sort of refuse to, or they try to rationalize all of it.
Yeah, and they, even when they're mostly on board, I mean, Blake pulls another trick soon, but it still even seems like they're kind of hoping that it doesn't end up true until we get to the awakening rituals, and then they're all like,
oh,
okay,
wow.
shit, I guess this actually is true.
Yeah.
This whole... So Blake sends Evan off to get a piece of paper and a pen, and he comes back and he does some writing, and there's this whole section, Evan is just fucking adorable. He's awesome. This section really is a highlight for me. And this is really where Evan is like, he's solidified his place as one of the most adorable characters that has ever existed.
Yeah, he's such a trooper. Throughout this whole thing, like an exasperated trooper at times. Like the bit where they have a go at him for forgetting the apostrophe is hilarious. But it's he's so adorable the whole way through.
They have a go at him for forgetting the apostrophe, and his response is, "I'm a bird. I'm a kid. I'm dead." And Blake's like, yes, there are extenuating circumstances.
He's a great. He's definitely great at balancing out the sort of tone of the story as well, with his sort of optimism and innocence. Blake and Rose are already both kind of quite beaten down by this story and the events before it. So Evan is this sort of beacon of light that is working really well.
Yes. I want to pull out one other interesting quote as well when Blake is kind of reflecting on how his friends are very slow to believe him. He thinks, was this the natural resistance to the unknown? Why hadn't I run into it when Rose first showed up? Which is an interesting kind of disconnected thought that is just out of place enough to make me think, why is this here? What is this trying to say?
I actually went to pull this out and put it in our notes, but I saw you already had, because it stands out.
Yeah.
It definitely feels like, a little seed being planted, I guess. I mean, there could be like a benign explanation, like because Blake and Rose already had a magical connection. There was some, thing, because of that, he just instinctively trusted her more, and he didn't like comprehend that was why, because he hadn't awakened yet. But I don't know. Yeah, this it just stands out as this little line where you're like, okay, that's a mystery that I should just be aware exists.
Yeah, keep one eye on this thing over here. Yeah.
Of course, there's like 100 things I'm meant to be doing that for, which is like... I mean, this is...
most of them are forgotten.
This is why I really love long-form story stuff, particularly the Wildbow ones, because when you got so many balls being juggled, it's it's easy to forget which ones are in the air, and then you can catch you off guard. It's great.
Well, you forget about one of the balls that you're juggling, and then, of course, that's the one that comes back and becomes very important.
Yeah, exactly.
So, obviously, Blake's friends aren't fully convinced yet, and so Blake does a much less convincing argument where he draws a diagram on a coffee table and has it move, 2 feet, not very far. And this is what convinces everybody. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting that there's a bit of a debate about whether or not he had faked this or how he could fake it. And everyone's sort of talking about why he couldn't have done it. And Alexis is sort of the only one who's in the background, keeps chiming in that he wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And it really solidifies that extra close relationship he and Alexis have. Like, there's so much trust there, and I don't want Wildbow to take it away. Please don't.
She, well, no comment. We'll see. The thing I like about this as well is, Alexis rightfully points out, like, what is the motivation that he would have for faking this? Like, does he want them to think that he's crazy? I don't understand.
Yeah. She's right. The only solution, if this isn't real, then he's just gone on some elaborate ploy to make them think he's insane. Which what does he get out of that?
Yeah.
Like, I guess unless he's building an insanity defense for murdering Evan.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess. Anyway, so they're convinced by this, and Blake kind of continues to fill them in about the world of magic that they're becoming a part of, right?
Yeah, and this section basically boils down to Blake says something horrible about the world of magic. They all look horrified, but Blake doesn't think they look horrified enough, so he goes back to step one and tells them something else horrible about the world of magic. And it's kind of rinse and repeat until he runs out of stuff to say, and they just all confirm that they're in either way.
Yeah, I want to pull out one of them because I think it's, again, a fun beat. They're talking about Granny Thorburn, and Blake says she was an eminent diabolist, I said. Someone who traffics in the really bad stuff. I saw some eyes go wide. Not wide enough. They didn't get it. Not yet.
Which I don't know why they would from just that very brief description.
Yeah, it doesn't convey it very well, but this whole bit has this weird, like, judgmental tone from Blake. It feels like he's being very critical about how slow his friends are to kind of get it, which, I don't know, it feels kind of harsh.
Yeah, I interpreted it a bit differently. I almost feel there's like a part of him that doesn't want them to be eager to help him because, they're signing up for really bad stuff. And that's sort of this bit where he didn't get an option either. So he's trying to convey the seriousness of what they're signing up for. And basically the fact that they're still saying yes, from his perspective, kind of tells them that he's not doing a good enough job of saying how serious it is. Like, it's this weird sort of catch-22 he's stuck in where it's like, as long as they're still willing to help him, he doesn't feel like he's done a good enough job of explaining how horrible it really is.
Yeah, you're right. He eventually runs out of ways to scare them, though, and has to kind of resign himself to, especially with Tiffany, who he's like, you can tell he's kind of like, I don't feel like I should awaken you, but I need help, so I'm going to have to do it.
For sure.
Anyway, so Joseph dips. Correct move,
Smart
Joseph,
man.
I think. Yeah. Goosh and Joel both kind of say, hey, look, like, we want to hear you out, but we can't really commit to something that's going to become our entire lives.
Which is the next best play.
Yeah. So they kind of stick around, but don't commit to being practitioners, which leaves Tiffany, Alexis, and Tyler to awaken.
Yeah, so it looks like they're probably going to have two blackguards, but Goosh and Joel both sort of seem to imply that they'd be willing to become practitioners when, the people holding them to not doing that are out of the picture. So, like, pretty good result overall. That's, 5 out of 6 in a generous sort of, scoring.
Yeah, and, Joel has already kind of in the story been a bit of Blake's support, right? Offering him his car, all kinds of miscellaneous helpful things. And so you can kind of easily imagine him becoming the blackguard and helping out with this stuff.
Yeah.
So the knights come back, and Blake kind of starts the awakenings. Tyler awakens, then Alexis, and then Tiffany.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this great bit as the knights sort of first arrive, and they're like, "Oh, you're awakening these people," and Blake's like, "Yeah," and the knight's like, "Don't you know that you're actually meant to clear that with like the local lord, or it's really bad manners?" And Blake's just like, "Well, I mean,
what's he gonna do? Imprison me?"
Like, he's not gonna say yes. So the whole thing. But I think Blake tries to clarify that Conquest wouldn't go after them specifically, and the Knights seem to think he wouldn't. That seems like flimsy logic to me, but I think this whole bit where, it's like you're meant to have cleared it with the local lord is really setting up that sort of those stakes of these guys as they're awakened are going to be Team Blake, and they're going to be against Team Conquest, and that's like, that's a risky proposition to be signing up to.
Yeah, I like that Blake is trying to be like, oh, well, technically he should just hold it against me. Like, he's kind of forgotten that he's going up against the incarnation of
Conquest. Yeah,
Conquest.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's assuming a bit too much nicety for what we've seen of Conquest so far.
Yeah, bless Blake's optimistic heart. So this is this is kind of literarily, is that a word? Interesting, right? Where we see the same ritual 3 times in a row, right?
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't feel repetitive. It's really well written, and I think the reason why it doesn't feel repetitive is this awakening ritual is basically a very distilled version of just kind of diving into who these characters are, or at least who these characters see themselves as, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting kind of little bit of just deeply diving into their characterization while, yeah, just getting to explore it. It's fun. It makes it not drag on, even though it is the same ritual on 3 times on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason it works is because, like, Wildbow trims the fat, and we only see those important bits, which, as you said, are the bits where they're sort of telling us bits about themselves through this word association part. Because, like, I went back and looked at chapter 1.7, where they do the awakening, where Blake and Rose awaken, to sort of do some comparative stuff we'll get into in a sec. But theirs goes for a lot longer because, like, for the first one, Wildbow gave us the start and the end, whereas for this part, he's trimmed it down to the bits we really need to see that are important and that are varied, so it doesn't feel repetitive.
Yeah, true. Also, I think Evan says hi to each of them as they awaken, and they each get this moment of like seeing Evan talk, which really rounds out each ritual in a really nice way, I think.
Yeah, and he's just so cute.
Yep. So Blake has his coven. He's got 3 new practitioners, and of course they've got 15 minutes to learn the basics, and then they have to fight Conquest.
Yeah, I just had to pull out, and I want to read out verbatim the last 3 lines of this chapter because they're just fantastic. So Blake says, "Nick, want to help me out? My friends need a 15-minute crash course in magic. I'm not that knowledgeable." And then Blake says again, "Me either, but it's going to have to do. We've got to deal with Conquest." And it's just this real sense of, look, we're a bunch of rookies, and we're trying to teach another bunch of rookies, but let's go fight the big boss. Like, it really hammers home this sense of unpreparedness and underdogness. It's a real David and Goliath type battle coming up.
Well, Granny Thorburn practiced for her whole life. She died. Blake's been a practitioner for 10 days. He's doing fine. So maybe this 15-minute prep course will make them the best practitioners yet? I don't know.
I mean, that's optimistic, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, he's really 80-20ing on the on teaching these practitioners all the essentials.
Yeah.
Essentials, actually. Pun, right?
Oh, I get it.
Yep. All right. So that's basically the end of the chapter. I just want to say one more time, Evan was awesome this whole chapter. He was a real highlight. It was awesome. Good times.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we talked about how last chapter was all about introducing us to the fact that Blake has genuine allies who really like him.
Yeah.
And contrasting that with Conquest. And I feel like this one was all about introducing us more to a big chunk of those allies. So, we met Tyler. We also met Joseph. And we got to see a lot more of Goosh, Joel, and Alexis and Tiffany. So it feels like this is the chapter of establishing his new allies and what they're all about.
Yeah. And hopefully they live long, happy lives, and this all goes well.
Yes, it's not going to. It's just no way this ends well.
That's a conversation for another time, because that's the end of 6.2.
Yes, and so for our bonus bit today, what we've done is we've pulled out all of the word associations that everyone did in this chapter, and we also went back and got Blake and Rose's ones, and we just thought we compare sort of what they said and try and analyze a bit what we think this says about our new companions who will be joining the story for the next little bit.
Yeah. Let's go through them in order, and I guess we'll get to the ones that I think are the most interesting. We can kind of call it the ones that we really want to talk about as we get to them.
Yeah. So the first one, like the first thing they're meant to associate is a dagger. And so Blake and Rose both said this was war, although Rose was kind of copying Blake at the time, so don't know how important that is. I think Tyler has a pretty interesting answer to this. He says it's all about like cutting the ties to his old self, so he thinks of it more in a separation sense. And Alexis probably has the most interesting one, where she says it's all about sculpting and carving, which is a very positive take, I think, for a dagger. Like almost everyone else,
for a dagger,
everyone else goes somewhere violent. Like Tiffany says that it's dangerous if not handled with care, which I think is a bit of a metaphor for maybe her more than the dagger. But we'll talk about that at the end.
Her, or maybe even
her experience with other people.
Yeah, definitely. I would say. I like that this we mentioned this before. This gives us a real dive into each of these people and what they kind of, the lenses that they see the world through, right? Tyler kind of sees himself in terms of his aspirations, I would say.
Yes, he's always about moving forward or moving on. He doesn't want to be stuck. He's very much someone who is always trying to reinvent himself, and all of his answers sort of reflect that.
Yeah, interestingly, Alexis is, on the whole, I would say, she often has quite negative interpretations of a lot of things, right? Except for this one. This one, to me, seems like the most positive, the most positive interpretation that she takes, which is weird because it is a dagger, right?
Yeah, Alexis is probably the only set of answers right now that doesn't jump out to me with like a sort of fairly straightforward pattern, or not straightforward, but like there's no pattern that I can see emerging from Alexis's answers, whereas Tyler's and Tiffany's, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what was trying to be conveyed through their answers, whereas Alexis is still a bit of a mystery to me, and I think that's maybe intentional.
I think the theme that runs through Alexis's answers is she possibly her defining herself by her trauma. Maybe not for the dagger so much, but when we get to the Dreamcatcher and the skull, and especially the rose, I think, and her personal item, it really seems that she sees herself a bit as a direct product of her trauma. And although we don't really specifically know what it is, we can kind of make stabs at the kind of region, right?
Yeah.
Which is why it's so interesting that for dagger she says sculpting or carving, which are, carving maybe can have some negative interpretations, but on the whole, it's pretty positive.
Partnered with sculpting, it definitely implies like, wood carving, not like flesh carving.
Yeah. Maybe the answer for her is kind of being shaped by her history. Maybe that's...
Yeah, I like that, actually.
Maybe that's the theme. Anyway, let's move on. Next up is the hourglass or the Stonehenge.
Yeah, well, so Blake and Rose both said time for this one in unison, which makes sense because they had a legit hourglass. Tyler kind of rattles on for a bit on this one, but it's basically all about, he thinks of it as time changing, more or less, is sort of what I took from his. Alexis's is one that really baffles me. She goes on about how Stonehenge was all about phases of the moon, which I guess, but then she talks about she just says the sentence female, I guess, which... as far as I'm aware, I don't associate Stonehenge with anything female, and apart from the concept of an hourglass figure, I don't know what else she could possibly be getting at. I actually don't really know what this answer is trying to tell us.
Yeah, Tiffany gives the clearest interpretation here, right? Which is deceptively simple, has history. Again, Tiffany's answers are all like something on the surface, but something underneath.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Then we have the Dreamcatcher, which Blake and Rose said was Dream and Fate. Pretty standard answers. Tyler and Tiffany both kind of essentially go at the same point, which is it's all about thinking outside the box and being a bit alternative. Tyler more specifically links it to the fact that he doesn't want to be like a salary man, like he wants to be an artist or a wizard.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And then Alexis goes with bondage. Which is an interesting interpretation. As he said, it's a more negative one. She's talking about being tied down by it, basically.
Yeah, this is one that's a bit strange to me. I think the Dreamcatcher, Blake and Rose, I think gave the obvious answers in their ritual, which was dreaming, right? Having dreams, having aspirations, and fate. But the other three, I don't know what to make of this. They do kind of interpret it a lot very differently.
I mean, I guess for me, Tyler and Tiffany's interpretations actually make a lot of sense. Like, I do think of dream captures as something that are very, like, new agey, I guess. So that sort of makes sense to me. The concept of, like, I guess they've got intricate, like, string work, so I can see the link to tying up and bondage and stuff, but it seems like a bit of a leap to me for Alexis to get there. So I think it's saying a lot. So then next up we had the skull, which Blake and Rose said was doom and death respectively. Tyler again brings it to time, and he says that this is all about being until death. So it's sort of the same answer, but he chucks in that thing about turning it into his time. Alexis compares it to violence, which makes sense. Like, I can see that.
It makes sense. I don't know, but I feel like it's a more negative interpretation because a skull is death, yes, but I don't know. I don't see it as violence. Right?
I guess I more think of like the skull, an icon, like the sort of thing Punisher wears on his chest, or pirate flags fly.
Or skull and crossbones, a Jolly Roger.
Yeah, like that's sort of that was what I assumed she was going for. It is it's a symbol of causing death, basically.
Okay.
And then
I can see that.
Tiffany has this interesting thing where she's not sure if it's frightening or beautiful when something is sort of laid bare, which feels like there's a lot of meaning hidden behind that one.
I really like Tiffany's answers. They're very like the symbolism. She very is kind of clearly like presenting her thesis on the world, right? Or her thesis on herself.
Even though I don't feel like I have something too concrete to say to any of her specific answers, you do really walk away with this sense of getting an understanding of her as a whole. Anyway, so next up we have the coin, which Blake and Rose said fortune and ruin. Tyler mentions that everything sort of has a price to it. Alexis mentions that it's all about pride, which I think kind of ties in with Rose's interpretation of ruin a bit. Like, it's because pride comes before the fall, I guess. Well, maybe that's me adding my interpretation to their interpretations, but and then interestingly, Tiffany, it's not mentioned the coin at all. It goes straight from the skull to the rose and hers. So I don't know if that's missing for a reason or what's going on there, but it's just not in it.
I think the one I like, the coin answer I like the most actually is Rose's. And I know we kind of missed the boat on talking about it, but it just is a great way of summing up how her whole life has been like, oh, the family's competing to get this money, and yes, that will just fuck up your life.
It is a great encapsulation of her character and her history / fake history. And so then finally for the set of items we have the rose. Blake says his family, which makes a lot of sense. Rose says herself, which makes a lot of sense. Tyler ties it back to all the other things and says that he thinks the rose is all about like, things live and then they die, and he wants to dedicate himself wholly to this, which Blake finds concerning. Alexis says it's associated with pain. I guess she's focusing on the thorns. And I like Tiffany's answer the most because this is exactly what I think of when I see flowers, which is they're symbolic and they're pretty, but they're basically useless. Like, they just sit there until they die. So I like that.
The rose is the most interesting of the 6 items to me because it doesn't have a clear association, right? The other 5 are they're pretty surface level. For Blake and Rose's answers, I think they kind of get to cheat because
when of the association of their family
that has but for Tyler, Alexis, and Tiffany, they really have to think about it more. I like as well that Tiffany doesn't go for the thorns angle, like, oh, it's pretty, but it has thorns, right? Which is kind of what she was talking about with Dagger, right? Dangerous if not handled with care. But she kind of dives into it being non-functional and useless and not worthy, which is, tragic, but does kind of talk about her history a bit.
So it's funny, just now as we're having this conversation, I've just noticed, I don't think Blake has told them about Rose at all, like the person. And she doesn't come up in any of their bits where they're talking to Evan as well. I guess because she's with she's with Conquest. What am I saying? Of course, she doesn't come up, but like that's going to be a whole thing when they learn about Rose.
Yeah, I mean, I get, yeah, she's with Conquest, and so she's not the most pressing thing right now, but, you know, you do have a mirror twin, Blake, like...
You're going to have to spend a minute explaining that. Yeah, and so then finally, the other most interesting one, I think, is the personal item that you have to bring, because obviously this says a lot about you.
Yeah.
So as a reminder, Blake used Joel's keys because they represented like his relationship to his friends and his bike. We still don't know what Rose picked because Blake wasn't nosy enough, and I'm still bitter about that.
Yep.
Then Tyler used a USB stick with, basically his life's history on it. He's got all his photos and poetry he wrote, and it's really, I think it represents him and his history, and I actually really, really like that one. Like that's probably the sort of thing I would have tried to bring.
Yeah, it's a very good encapsulation of who he is, like his journey and what he values the most, which is his kind of growth and his quest for the things that he loves to do.
Yeah, and since this is the last one, we may as well just sort of summarize. Like, I think, all of Tyler's answers have something to do pretty much with time and the passage of time and moving forward, not staying stagnant, and that's really something.
He'd be a great Bahame.
Yeah, he's definitely he also he reminds me of Blake in that way. Like he doesn't seem to want to sit still. Yeah. He has to be moving forward. Like I think that's a trait they seem to share a bit.
Yeah, and not just that though. Blake is critical of this trait, right? Like this is the part throughout Tyler's awakening. Blake is kind of making comment about how some of the answers are worrying to him because he doesn't see Tyler as the type to stick to one thing, and Tyler's giving very like, oh, I'm committing myself to this answers. But I think you're right that this is a trait that Blake, Blake's impulsivity is something his impulsiveness is something we've talked about a lot this whole story. I think it's interesting that he's criticizing not the same thing, but a pretty similar thing in Tyler here.
Yeah, although to be fair, a lot of people have criticized it in Blake, and also Blake didn't want to be here. Like we always got to keep in mind is he's got that he's torn between having invited the rest of them, which is an opportunity he didn't get.
Yeah.
So then Alexis uses her dentures as her item, and she talks about how they're fragile and a sign that you are damaged as you go. You get damaged as you go through life, and she wants to be someone who helps to fix them, like the dentures help to fix her injuries.
Yeah. Again, I think there's I think something I like about this is we get kind of a reflection of Blake in each of these final personal items, right?
Yeah.
Blake's impulsiveness from Tyler. We get Blake's kind of drive to do good despite his quite negative, or perhaps because of his quite negative past, from Alexis. And then talking about Tiffany, the kind of the reminder of the baggage that family can bring.
Yes, because she brings an AA chip, which she doesn't say who exactly it belongs to, but I get the impression it's one of her parents.
She says it's not hers.
Yeah, and then she sort of talks about what sounds like a terrible upbringing, and I assume I assume it's one of her parents because she talks about being let down by somebody who didn't keep their promise to stay away from drugs and alcohol. Yeah,
maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I do feel like it's her mother, if not both her parents, just because of kind of the way that she feels about herself. It makes sense to me if that's a reflection of problems with her mother. I don't know.
I have no idea. I haven't given it much thought, but it's definitely it's definitely I don't know. It's definitely a parent vibe or a step parent type thing. Whoever raised her, for sure.
Yeah, and like we said, obviously baked into that is a reliance to trust family and even kind of searching for a way to define yourself outside of your family, your origin, whatever. Again, which is a pretty good reflection of Blake.
But I think the pattern that emerges in Tiffany's answers, and we didn't really talk about any pattern in Alexis's that much because, as I said, I haven't really seen that much of one apart from, as you said, sort of trying to be that fixer. But for Tiffany, all of her answers have to do with whether there's more under the surface. Daggers are dangerous if not used correctly, so they can be used well. Stonehenge has history. I think with her, it's all about there being more under the surface. Which hopefully that's true for her as well, because one of the things before this was she said she's not great under pressure, so this will be her opportunity to step up if she's got it in her.
Yeah, definitely. And her opportunity to see. I mean, you get the sense that she wants to demonstrate that she too has more under the surface. So, this is your chance, Tiff.
But so that's all the characters who have awakened. Who are, we've sort of gone through. And so I thought it'd also be fun, Ruben, to put you on the spot and ask you to do the word associations as well. Obviously, since this is a podcast, I can't do visual things, so I'm just going to pretend to hold up items, and you'll tell me what they make you think of.
Sure.
Okay, so
hit me. What's
first off, I'm holding up a dagger.
A dagger makes me think of stabbing, makes me think of our audience taking a stab at interpreting the story, and if they want to do that, the best place to do that is in our discussion threads, which you can find linked in the episode description down below.
Interesting. Okay, well, so the next item, I think the next bowl was an hourglass.
An hourglass, obviously time is a big factor, and of course the next time that we will get together and record an episode, that episode will be coming out on Friday the 3rd of May. That'll be 6.3, so that's what that makes me think of, our next episode.
Makes sense. So the next one up is a dream catcher.
Dreams, coming from all around and being caught in the dream catcher kind of reminds me of, I guess, the internet and all the wireless waves going around. And of course, that makes me think of our website, duffmedia.com, where you can go to get all the news about our show as well as all the other great shows on there.
And next up, we have the skull.
Of course. Well, a skull is death and horror, and pain and torment. And of course, nothing sums it up more than Twitter to me. So if you're into masochism and stuff like that, you should self-harm yourself by checking out our Twitter, which is @MediaMD Podcast. It's more fun than it sounds.
And up next is the coin.
Well, of course, Elliot, I'm all about getting that coin, and the way that we get that coin at the moment is by being backed by all our Patreons. If you want to support this show, you can head to patreon.com/duffmedia. I guess I'm talking to the spirits here.
The spirits go to patreon.com/doofmedia. And once they're done there, they're going to see that the next bowl that I'm holding up in front of you contains a rose.
A rose, yes. Well, of course, a rose is beautiful and only lives because of the support of the sun and the water that rains down upon it. Just like Wildbow's stories only live because of the support that rained down upon them from Wildbow's Patreon, which is patreon.com/Wildbow. So head over there too, spirits.
And so finally, what is the personal item you've brung, and why did you bring it?
Yeah, well, of course, my personal item is the other podcast that we do together, Media MD. And a new episode of Media MD actually has just come out, interestingly enough. We're talking about the other a superhero TV show called Umbrella Academy that came out earlier this year. So that's my personal item. That episode, which is just released yesterday.
Oh, that's a pretty cool personal item. I approve. Is there anything else you want to say to the spirits? Any declaration of who you are before we head out?
Yep, I guess there's one final thing that I want to say about kind of defining myself, and that's we'll see you next time. Bye.
See ya.